Good morning, everyone. We'd like to start off with the university's land acknowledgement statement before we begin our program today. Brown University is located in Providence, Rhode Island, on lands that are within the ancestral homelands of the Narragansett Indian tribe. We acknowledge that beginning with colonization and continuing for centuries, the Narragansett Indian tribe have been dispossessed of most of their ancestral lands in Rhode Island by the actions of individuals and institutions. We acknowledge our responsibility to understand and respond to these actions. The Narragansett Indian tribe, whose ancestors stewarded these lands with great care, continues as a sovereign nation today. We commit to working together to honor our past and build our future with truth. I'd also like to point out the exits for today's building. We have exits to our right over here, and then also to the top of the building over there. This door is not an exit. Thank you, everyone.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Oh, come on. Good morning. Good morning. Hey. Good morning, everyone. It gives me no greater pleasure than to welcome all of you. I know that you will be inspired by this really wonderful opportunity to learn about a critical moment in emergency medicine history from a person who quietly, and maybe not so quietly, led the emergency medical services movement, Mr. John Moon. My name is Dr. Vanessa Brito, and I have the pleasure of serving as Associate Vice President for Campus Life and Executive Director for Health and Wellness. As most of you know, Health and Wellness is comprised of 5 departments, of which Emergency Medical Services is one. Amy Sanderson and I, who you'll hear from in a moment, Amy's the chief of the Emergency Medical Services, and over the past 7 years, Amy and I have had a really, I think, very close and wonderful relationship in our respective roles. In a conversation that Amy and I had some time ago, Amy shared with me a book that she found to be important and a story that she thought I should know. It proved to be the amazing origin story of EMS, and the book, American Siren. Fast forward to this past fall, I have the pleasure of meeting the person who was central to this history and this story, and learning more about the birth of the emergency medical movement firsthand. When I returned to campus, Amy and I had a very excited conversation about my chance, or maybe not so chance meeting, and the criticality of this story. The need to share with all of you its place in the history of pre-hospital and emergency medical care was clear. Amy took the idea of sharing this story to heart, particularly for all of you. Her team is central. Brown EMS is central. It's key to our first responder system here, and it was important to share it not just with you, but also with the entire Brown community. So maybe I'm being a little cryptic on this cold January Saturday morning, but I want to bring Amy Anderson up to warm your hearts and share with you the degree to which our guest speaker, Mr. John Moon, and the story he carries has touched her personally and professionally. The fact that you're here this morning says that you're also eager to be active listeners, to learn, and to be inspired. I now have the pleasure of introducing to you Amy Anderson, Chief of Emergency Medical Services at Brown University. Amy.
Thank you, Dr. Brito. Welcome, everyone. And I want to say that I'm just going to add a few extra words. Can't see you. It is an honor for Brown EMS to welcome an individual who helped to establish the foundations of our field, the field we work in. It's pretty remarkable to have you here today. And your perseverance against so many gigantic systemic barriers helped to open so many doors that other people were able to walk through after you. From the time that you earned your way to being a paramedic on the Freedom House ambulance in 1972 to the time you retired from EMS as a chief in the department for the city of Pittsburgh in 2009, you have been, Chief John Moon, you have been a leader in your field, a mentor to very many people, and a true advocate for social justice and change. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce to everyone here today Chief John Moon and the legacy of Freedom House.
Thank you so much. I really can't thank you all enough for this opportunity. Whether you all believe it or not, you are helping me fulfill the desires of my heart, and that's to make sure that this important part of history is not forgotten, because it's been dormant for well over 50 plus years. And once I retired from the city of Pittsburgh, I kind of went on this personal mission to kind of bring this part of history, which is the evolution of EMS that we take for granted, that's glorified on television, where the foundation of it began. So in order for you to get a clear understanding of where we're going, I'm going to have to take you back in time. I'm going to take you back quite a number of years, and looking around the audience, very few of you were even born. So I'm going to take you back into the 60s, and I'm going to take you back to a somewhat neglected, underserved neighborhood that I grew up in. And in this neighborhood, housing was a problem, jobs were a problem, medical care was a problem, and the city leaders at that particular time had very little, if any, concern about this poor black neighborhood. And as this neighborhood continued to thrive and to struggle, there was an organization that turned out to be a community center by the name of Freedom House. And in Freedom House, it was primarily responsible for finding jobs for African Americans, job training, voter registration. There was even a little mini food bank in this community center. And one of the board of directors of this community center, Phil Howland, the gentleman there in the suit, he came up with a vision. And he said, if this community can deliver food to the residents of this neglected, underserved neighborhood, why can't they deliver medical care? Because the residents didn't have transportation back and forth to doctor's appointments. So unfortunately, since they couldn't make it to the doctors, some of their medical issues were exacerbated as a result of that. He came up with the concept of, if we can deliver food, then we can deliver medical care. But he didn't know how to get that vision of his out into the world or out into the community. So he approached the local hospital, which was Presbyterian Hospital, which is UPMC Medical Center now. And they put him in touch with a gentleman by the name of Dr. Peter Saffer. Now, Dr. Peter Saffer was also a visionary. And it was his vision that it wasn't how fast you got that person to the emergency room that made the outcome of their life or condition, but what was being done for them before they got there. But no one would believe him. He tried to get it out. He tried to tell people that you can breathe for a person, you can do CPR on them. No one believed him. Up comes this organization that wanted to get medical care to their community, and they approached Dr. Peter Saffer. And they said to him, we would like to improve the medical care to our communities. If I can reflect on your memory, this community had to rely on the police to get back and forth or to get to the emergency room. The police and the community had a very, what I would call, adversarial relationship. So they decided whether they wanted to come transport you to the emergency room or not, how long it took them to get there, or whether they wanted to come at all. So with this adversarial relationship, that was really a very dark time in that time period between the police and the African American community. Fast forward, the board of directors of Freedom House met with Dr. Saffer, and he said, I have this vision. I want to get out to the world that if I can teach people that it's not how fast you get them there, but what's being done before them, then we can do a great thing. And the board of directors from Freedom House said, okay, well, we'll buy into your vision, but we have one requirement. Every person you train has to be black. And he agreed to it. So Dr. Saffer, in turn, took 25 black men, placed them into a training program, the most sophisticated training program that had ever been done. We spent time in the emergency room, in the operating room, in the intensive care units, in the cardiac care units, not actually observing, but treating patients. You are presently looking at the very first person in this country to do a tracheal intubation in the field. It had never been done before. And that presented its own set of challenges I'll get to a little later. But you have these guys in this training program, and they're learning how to read EKG strips, and they're learning how to start IVs and administer medications and treat trauma patients and burn patients and things like that. And you take them and you put them in a vehicle. Now, the problem at that time was that the only vehicles that were available were police vans. And you couldn't do CPR in there. There was no place around in there where you could sit. So with the help of the individuals from Freedom House, we redesigned your modern day ambulance. That BP cuff that you see on the wall, that suction unit, that oxygen unit, we designed that. The seat at the head of the patient in every EMS unit across this country, we designed the modern day ambulance. So you take these individuals and you put them in this vehicle and you send them to treat this underserved, neglected neighborhood. One of the challenges we had to deal with is that the community was accustomed to the police coming to get them. Imagine, if you will, a police wagon pulling up to your residence, 2 officers getting out, walking to your homes. At that time, they were primarily white males. There was no diversity, equity, and inclusion at that time. And coming to your residence and escorting you out to a police van and placing you in the back, and both officers getting up front. And away you went to the emergency room. If something happened to you back there, you stopped breathing or your heart stopped beating, there was no one back there to help you. So oftentimes you were worse off than when they came to get you. Freedom House wanted to change that. But like I said, the community wasn't accustomed to it. So we had to teach the community that every time a Freedom House vehicle rolled up to your residence, expect the personnel to take your blood pressure. Expect them to start an IV or to give you oxygen or to read your heart rate. No more riding in the back of a police wagon without care. So the community was so accustomed to that why are you just sitting here with my loved one? Why don't you just transport them to the emergency room? If something happens to them, I'm going to sue you. They were not accustomed to the emergency room being brought to them. So that was one of the challenges. Another one is that emergency rooms themselves were not accustomed to a person coming in there saying, the blood pressure is 120/80. I've started an IV on the person. I've given them this medication. Their heart rate is tachybrady and the vital signs are normal. They were not accustomed to that. In addition, what made the matters even more challenging is they were not accustomed to someone looking like me coming into the emergency room and giving them a complete rundown on the status of the patient. As a matter of fact, I can recall the one main time that I did that, and we transported a young gentleman to the emergency room who had suffered a syncopal episode at work, and we started an IV on him, and we did a complete workup on him, pertinent past history, his vital signs, sent EKG rhythm and things all that nature, and I walked into the emergency room. And the nurse said, okay, put him in this room. And I said, okay, well, so you know, we have a 29-year-old male here who suffered a syncopal episode at work while lifting boxes. His blood pressure is 120/80. We started an IV on him. His lung sounds are clear. We listened to his heart, and there's a slight heart murmur. The EKG shows a tachybrady rhythm. And so right now, he's stable. And she bust out laughing. She had never experienced that before. Of course, I got offended. So I go back and talk to our medical director, and I tell her, I said, I don't even know why we're doing this. She didn't even listen to me. She said, if you don't learn to speak the language of the emergency room, then no one will ever listen to you. Go back in there and find a physician, which I did, and basically gave them the same rundown, and it was received a whole lot better. So as we're going through these different challenges with the community and with the emergency rooms and things like that, we hit another hurdle. We hit the hurdle where we had patients that did not want us to touch them because of who we were. Can't you just transport me to the hospital? Why do you need to take my blood pressure? Why do you need to put the electrodes on my chest? So we had to come up with an idea to try to offset that. So we simply said, okay, if you don't let me do the things that I'm trained to do, then the chances of you arriving at the emergency room alive starts to decrease as long as we're standing here talking. And oftentimes they were able to change their mind. In addition to that, we were only allowed to provide pre-hospital care in our own neighborhood. This underserved, neglected, rundown neighborhood. And as a result of that, your more affluent neighborhoods had to rely on the police. And we had a call one day where a young child was struck by a bus, and he was severely injured. And the police arrived on the scene, and they didn't know what to do. So the officer gets on the radio and says, can you send Freedom House? And the dispatcher says, no, I can't send them because it's not their district. He said, well, you better send someone out here that knows what the hell they're doing. Fortunately for us, One of the other challenges that we had to overcome is that the police did not give us the calls in our own neighborhoods. Maybe someone was a victim of violence or drug overdose or what have you. And they would come and grab the person and transport them. And once we discovered that, we had to come up with a way to offset that. So we bought a police scanner, and we monitored the police calls. And we would self-dispatch. And oftentimes we would arrive on the scene of the patient's residence, treat the patient, transport him to the emergency room, and then pass the police on the way to the hospital. And if you look at that, that in itself turned out to be one of our downfalls. Because your affluent communities discovered that how dare you have these people in this rundown, welfare-consumed neighborhood getting better medical care than I do. Mr. Mayor, I voted for you. I contributed to your campaign. I own this business. You better do something. So the mayor couldn't just get rid of Freedom House because he knew he had a contract with us to provide care in the business district. And as a result of that, every year we would get roughly about $50,000 from the city of Pittsburgh for providing service. And back then that was a lot of money. So he decided, instead of expanding Freedom House into the rest of the city, he wanted to disband them altogether because he didn't have control over it and because of the makeup of the organization. So one of the ways he did that, and I'll get into, because just looking at your faces, I can tell that very few of you, if anybody, has ever heard of Freedom House. And even though that saddens me, I understand the reasons why, and I'll tell you shortly. Fast forward to the mayor, instead of expanding Freedom House into another district, he had to come up with a strategic plan to get rid of us. So he makes a call to the office and says, come down and see me. So one of our supervisory personnel in management went down, and in his mind, he's thinking, okay, wow, this is great. The mayor is calling us down, and we're going to expand. I got this program, how you can expand EMS into other neighborhoods. I'm going to give it to him, and everything's going to be fine. So we go down, and the mayor says, the reason I called you down is your sirens are making too much noise. Can you put a bell on the ambulances? So whenever Freedom House responded to the business district, we were not allowed to use our sirens. So if you were working in the business district and you called for a heart attack, then we would come and we'd stop at the light and wait for it to change and go to the next one and wait for it to change. And that impacted our response times. Another way he wanted to disband us is that we expected every year to get a check from the city of Pittsburgh for roughly about $50,000. So January comes, we get a check for $5,000. February, nothing. March, $10,000. April, another $5,000. So all of this was his way of trying to hamper the service. So that impacted not only our response times, it impacted our operations, it impacted our payroll, and so it made it very difficult. We could not survive or compete in a political environment. So behind the scenes, unbeknownst to us, he had taken our plan and given it to his new incoming EMS director. So everywhere there's an EMS station in the city of Pittsburgh presently is the same operational plan that Freedom House has suggested. And it's been that way for almost 50 years. So we have this mayor who wanted to start his own EMS system. He didn't want to get rid of Freedom House outright because it was embarrassing. But he started his own system, and he brought people in from the suburbs. He started an all-white EMS system. He brought a group of white males into the city to run his ambulance service. Now, you could probably think, so what's the big deal? Unfortunately, the individuals that came in with preconceived ideas on what it would be like coming into an urban environment. It's the most dangerous place in the world. I have to arm myself. So they brought in with them knives and guns. Pittsburgh EMS's vehicles had handcuffs on them. The personnel were dressed just like the police. So that authoritarian mindset was there. It was not unusual for a Pittsburgh EMS unit to pull a car over that ran a red light or a stop sign, and the paramedic gets out and challenges them or reprimands them from running this stop sign. In addition to that, the people, the personnel themselves, along with their preconceived idea, they stereotype different neighborhoods. In your somewhat economically deprived neighborhoods or your neglected neighborhoods, you're not going to get heart attacks, and you're not going to get strokes, and you're not going to get diabetes. Those people don't have those type of illnesses. All you're going to get by going into a public housing complex is domestic violence or a drug overdose or violence. If you want medical calls, go to your affluent neighborhoods. That's where your heart attacks and your strokes and your diabetes are. So they had to contend with that. So Freedom House itself, we lasted roughly about 8 years. And during those 8 years, we basically designed every EMS vehicle you see today. We actually wrote the very first paramedic manual, Emergency Care in the Streets, that every paramedic in the United States was required to read to become a paramedic. That's great in itself. But what I discovered later on is that as more and more editions are being printed with the same title, with the same author, Dr. Nancy Caroline, who was our medical director at the time, Freedom House is removed from any mentions in those textbooks. They talk about how great Miami's system is, and Los Angeles and Seattle and Jacksonville, how great those services are and what they have accomplished. And then, as a footnote, they said, Freedom House. Dr. Nancy Caroline was the medical director. We were only a group of black men that didn't have an opportunity to get a high school education. But we wrote the book. We made sure that every paramedic in the United States, in order to become one, you had to read this manual. I told you earlier that I was the very first person in the country to do a tracheal intubation in the field. And that was done as we were writing the text manual. I got called one day to go to the operating room of Presbyterian Hospital. Didn't know why I was going there. And I met the head of the department, Dr. Peter Saffer, who was the chief of the critical care medicine department at that time, as well as the anesthesiology department. So I donned all the operating attire, and we entered the room. And the minute I entered that door, everything stopped. It became as quiet then as it is now. The OR technician stopped looking at the patient. The anesthesiologist stopped doing what they were doing. The physician who was ready to prepare surgery, he stopped doing what he was doing, and they were all looking at me. And what I later found out is that the reason they were looking at me is the only time someone that looked like me came into that operating room was with a mop or a bucket. But I didn't have that. So Dr. Saffer simply says, go over to the head of the patient, tells the anesthesiologist, get up. Sit down and intubate that patient. At that time, I knew all of these people were watching me, no different than, I know you're out there, but I don't see you. Failure was not an option. Had I failed that procedure that day, there's a great chance the paramedics would not be doing it today because we were writing the very first paramedic manual, and that was part of the training process. So I successfully intubated the patient, and we went around during the course of the day to unsuspecting patients in the operating room performing tracheal intubations on them. High school education. Never been done before. So I take that skill, unbeknownst to me, and I go out one day, less than a week later, and perform it in the field. And if any of you all had listened to the documentary, and I kind of chronicle the history of that, that was just one of the challenges. Once I did it and we transported the patient to the emergency room, I got challenged by the ER doctor. Who did this? I did. And who are you? I'm John Moon, and I work for Freedom House Ambulance Service. And who told you to do it? Our medical director, Dr. Nancy Caroline. And fortunately for me, basically, there was a nurse there that knew that we were doing that procedure. So day in and day out, no matter what we had to deal with, basically, it was a challenge. But those challenges basically had to come to an end. And remember, Pittsburgh EMS was beginning in 1975. And Freedom House had an agreement with the city that they're going to take the people, take the equipment, take the vehicles, and we wouldn't have to go through any additional training. And that was a written agreement. But one thing wasn't in that agreement. It said I had to take you, but it didn't say I had to keep you. So, and I don't want anyone to mistake, I love Pittsburgh EMS. I love the people that work there. It will always have a special place in my heart, but we're talking about a different time. Pittsburgh EMS went on a systematic elimination process, and it eliminated roughly about 80% of the people that came over from Freedom House. We were put through additional training despite the fact that we had an agreement. I, myself, being the first person to intubate a patient in the field, was not allowed to do anything. And as such, I couldn't talk on the radio, I couldn't drive the vehicle, I couldn't examine patients. I was more or less a third person, all in an effort to frustrate me to say, okay, y'all got this. Until one day we went into a patient's home and the crew that I was working with, remember, I'm a third person observer. And we walked in and the patient was unconscious, not breathing, and didn't have a heartbeat. And the crew I was working with didn't know what to do. They panicked. And they turned around and looked at the person that wasn't allowed to do anything and say, you take over. So once I assigned, you do the IV, you put the person on the monitor, I'll do the intubation, and we saved the person's life, and that's fantastic. But it had to be kept quiet because I wasn't allowed to do anything. And from that point on, I had to make a decision. Do I remain this quiet, reserved observer that you're accustomed to, or do I step up my game and become more vocal, more outspoken about what's going on with the personnel from Freedom House? And I chose the latter. I wanted everybody in Pittsburgh EMS to know who John Moon was. So I became outspoken on patient care and patient treatments and things. And as I was doing that, I noticed that the department remained steadily white. Pittsburgh EMS, unfortunately, went 10 years without hiring an African American. And I mentioned just a couple of minutes ago that you probably have never heard of Freedom House. And the reason why is that Pittsburgh EMS wanted to make sure that never happened. Because if you get rid of the history makers, you essentially get rid of that part of history that they made. So you've not heard of Freedom House, and that's the reason why. But things, fortunately for me, are changing. As I rose through the ranks, I became more vocal. I became more outspoken. I challenged the department on its hiring processes. I designed the very first diversity recruitment program in the history of the department, not without opposition. So I used the format that Freedom House used. I went out into the community and I recruited people that had no idea what an EMT was, what a paramedic was, had never spoken to one, and I was able to place them into a training program and pay them a salary while they were there. And I was able to get Pittsburgh EMS to guarantee them a job. And that became the normal way of hiring until the troublemaker retired. And once the troublemaker retired, the department went back to its normal way of doing things. Now, things are about to change. And I'm no different than the average person. I wanted to go up through the ranks and one day become chief of Pittsburgh EMS. But unbeknownst to me, that was never going to happen. The department was designed to ever prevent that from happening. So for 30 plus years, Pittsburgh EMS used the next man up promotional process up until it was John Moon's time to be the next man up. And they changed the promotional process. And I was subsequently passed over by a white male that I had been his boss for about 15 years. Of course, I didn't take it sitting down, and remember, I'm a troublemaker by heart, and so I challenged the department on its promotional process. And you don't challenge your bosses and expect to have a happy life. So the department kind of made me an outcast, to say the least. But, you know, my diversity program remained. And unbeknownst to me at the time, a young lady walked into my office off the street and said, "I want to work for Pittsburgh EMS." And no one had ever done that before. So I hired her as an EMT, and she worked as an EMT for about 6 months and then got promoted to a paramedic, and then got promoted to a crew chief, then a supervisor, and then assistant chief, and then deputy chief, and now she's chief of the department. Little did I know, 20-some years ago, I was hiring the very first African-American chief of Pittsburgh EMS. And she's more or less my crowning glory. And I'm no longer there, but my legacy remains through her. And she's committed to working on diversity issues. She's committed to making sure that Freedom House's legacy is not forgotten. Her first order of business when she came in is to put a mural of Freedom House on her office wall. And throughout Pittsburgh EMS's offices are photos and plaques honoring Freedom House. And as a result of that, I like to think that I'm standing here talking to each and every one of you, but I want you to know it's not about me as an individual. I'm just the platform or the vehicle that's being used to bring this part of history back into the forefront. There she is. And what I want you to understand, it's about an organization. It's about a group of visionaries who took their vision and gave it to an innovator, Dr. Peter Saffer, who took his innovation and gave it to a group of people that by society's standards were the least likely to succeed. Society's throwaways, hardcore unemployables, which simply meant that nobody would hire you. And as I think about those labels that we had, society made one mistake. They didn't tell us. So we went about creating an EMS system that's emulated across this country, if not the world today. That's glorified on television. And as I think about the disappointments and setbacks and broken promises that we had to deal with while working at Freedom House, and then I look and I see the chief of Pittsburgh EMS, and I smile, and I'll say, it was all worth it. That is the legacy of Freedom House. Please. Now the fun starts. You have an opportunity to ask me any questions about EMS, Freedom House, and Pittsburgh EMS that comes to your mind. This is the part that I enjoy the most, is answering your questions. Yes?
We have some microphones, if you would mind using the microphone, just so that we can be sure that your voice is amplified and others can hear.
First of all, thank you very much. Just to give you an idea of where I'm coming from, Sid Bauman, class of '81. In 1982, I took the second emergency medical technician course offered at Brown University in this building, several flights up. Our textbook was Emergency Care in the Streets by Nancy Caroline. And thus I had heard about Freedom House, and I knew a little bit about its beginnings and its importance, but I had never known about its problematic transition to the city of Pittsburgh until I learned about you and started learning and the book, American Siren. So I'm very thrilled to meet you. This is very interesting. But I'm very curious about some of the, I have dozens of questions, by the way, about some of the beginnings of Freedom House. You didn't start, I think it was until '72, so you were there roughly for half of the ambulance service's life.
Correct.
But Freedom House existed both before the ambulance service started, and I presume it existed after the ambulance service was no longer part of Freedom House as an organization. So I guess two questions. One is, what happened to the rest of Freedom House that wasn't an ambulance service in 1975 when the ambulance service went away? And second, do we have records and information of the EMTs and paramedics who Dr. Saffer started with in 67, was it, thereabouts, before you came along? Do we know who they were? Do we have the rosters and things like that to honor those gentlemen?
The rosters themselves are in the book American Siren, those individuals. Freedom House, the organization itself, lasted, I would say, probably maybe a year before Freedom House was disbanded by the city of Pittsburgh. Yes, yes. Freedom House, the ambulance service, obviously, as I'm speaking with you, was an offshoot of the organization itself. So the organization, we kind of separated ourselves, not intentionally, from the organization because we start having input from foundations and organizations for grant funding and stuff like that. So that's where the majority of our funding came from. But the organization itself basically was the impetus of this whole creation. And unfortunately, they had a group photo up there. The majority of the people there are no longer with us that are in the group photo. That's me right there in the middle. Peter Saffer, Nancy Caroline, who was our medical director. And just to give you a little history on her, when she came to Freedom House, we didn't trust her. And the reason we didn't trust her is that over a course of time, physicians came in under the auspices of being our medical directors and things like that, and they would stay 6 months and then move on to bigger and better things, and we'd end up being their stepping stone to whatever roles they went to. So we got accustomed to that. So when she came, here's this other white lady who's coming in here, and she's just going to pad her resume and move on to the next place. She had to earn our trust. And the way she earned it is by spending time with us. She worked 24/7, 7 days a week. If you could imagine a 5'2" Jewish woman walking through the halls of a hospital with 4 black guys with afros and beards, walking right up into the intensive care unit, not stopping at the door, saying we're here, but walking right to the patient's bedside. What's the medication the patient's taking? What are the side effects of it? What is your EKG reading? So she was able to open doors for us that basically we were not able to get into. In addition to that, once she earned our trust, we also had to prove to her that we were capable of doing the things that we were doing. In addition to that, her goal was to prove to us that we were better than what we were. And she was very successful at doing that. So this photo itself is really the legacy component of it, but a lot of the individuals, it's no different than it was a job. So you had people come and go and, move on to different things and stuff like that. So I would say roughly, easily 75, 80 people had came through Freedom House during that time period. Yeah, absolutely.
Sir, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Let someone else ask the next question before I...
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Hi, I'd just like to say, first off, it's an honor to meet you.
Thank you.
I've been a paramedic for about 2 years, and reading the book was a huge inspiration, and it's just, I don't know, it's an honor to be in the same room with you. I wanted to ask, excuse me, if you could speak to, I don't know if you were working in the field before Narcan was commonly available to personnel, and I just wanted to ask about like how you guys were working your overdoses in that time. And I think something really cool that we're doing now is we're doing leave behind Narcan in problematic places where we run a lot of overdoses and such. And I don't know, I just want to hear your history with that particular medication.
Narcan is this wonder drug. Everybody has it. You can buy it over the counter at your local drugstore, and the addicts themselves carry it with them. And they even have distribution sites where you can go in and pick it up. But what you all don't know is we administered Narcan back in 1972. It's not this wonder drug that the world has seemed to think. And I was talking last night that we were so far ahead of our time that it even boggles my mind today. There was no fentanyl back then, so it was primarily heroin. And as we treated a patient, they never woke up in the back of our vehicles. We didn't want them to wake up. It was designed that way. So we kind of titrated the administration of Narcan and monitored your breathing and your level of consciousness until we could get you into the emergency room in a more controlled environment. So Narcan is, I'm sorry to break your hearts, is not this do-all drug that the world seems to think. But yeah, we administered for heroin overdoses back in 1972. So we were obviously the first to take it out of the operating room or the emergency room to treat narcotic overdoses. And we didn't want the patient to get mad that I'd ruined his $25 high and want to jump out of the vehicle and some of the things they do nowadays, or beat up the paramedics. So now I guess you just administer it and suffer the consequences of it. But yeah, Narcan, I'm, sorry to tell you all that it's not new. It really isn't. Because a lot of the things that paramedics do today is not new. Obviously, there's been changes and improvements and things like that. You got video intubation and blood administration. You got stretchers that lift themselves, which wasn't there when I was in the field. I enjoy the changes and things like that, but everything has a foundation to it. And the one thing I want you all to keep in mind is that the foundation of every EMS system in this country rests on the shoulders of a group of black men that society thought would never amount to anything. And that's where we are today. So Freedom House needs to be brought back into the forefront. I would like to see it taught at every EMT, or the history of EMS taught at every EMT or paramedic training program. I would like to see it taught in every EMS physician's training program, because that's a specialty now. And we created that. Now you have physicians, EMS physicians, all over the place, emergency room physicians and things. So they respond with you. We created all of that.
Thank you, sir. It's been an honor.
Is it easier to bring the microphone to you? Thanks, Amy.
Hi, thank you so much for coming to speak with us. I'm a little bit curious about the history a little bit, where you mentioned, I think her name is Nancy Caroline, is that
Yes.
correct? I know she was responsible for, the book, I forgot the name, sorry, it's a little bit long, but is she also not responsible for sort of like phasing out Freedom House from the textbooks?
No,
So how
No.
did that sort of happen? Like, who was responsible
that's
for
an
like,
excellent point. That's an excellent point. Dr. Nancy Caroline died in 2002. Dr. Safford died in 2003. The family sold the rights to the book to Bartlett Publishing. And through multiple editions, obviously they've added stuff to it, and the book is now this thick. So the editors of that book, which I'm working on getting that changed, they decided on their own to remove Freedom House from it. It didn't begin in Jacksonville. It didn't begin in Los Angeles, Seattle, or Miami. It began in Pittsburgh, in the Hill District, with a group of black men. And I can't begin to even tell you why the editors of the new edition decided to do it that way. But I'm working to get that changed, to put it back in its rightful place in that book. And unfortunately, that's just one of the many ways that things have evolved to remove any evidence of Freedom House. Oftentimes I get questions about the television show Emergency with Johnny and Roy in their red pickup truck. They began in 1972. We actually sent personnel from Freedom House to Los Angeles to work with the producer to help create that program. So Rampart, whoever they are, Randolph Montooth or whoever it is, yeah, they weren't the first paramedics.
Thank you so much for sharing with us today. Any plans to make a movie about this history, and who would you have play you?
I'm in negotiation with Denzel, but he yes. There's been a lot of attempts based on the book itself. Right now, Hearst Broadcasting has a documentary coming out. Fox Television is working on a movie deal to kind of bring this history back into the forefront from my eyes. So we'll see how that happens. They're coming to Pittsburgh in March, and I'll have to show them around the city with a writer and an executive producer and a showrunner and all these other people. They'll all be here. So the decision has already been made to make a series out of that. Now, how it's going to pan out, I may be some, who knows? I probably won't be the nice, innocent guy that I am now. So, but yeah, that's in the works now. We just have to wait and see.
Hi, thank
Hi.
you. So you've talked a lot about honoring the Black men who were part of the service, but you see in the photo there's a lot of Black women, and I just wanted to know if you could speak a little bit about their experience and the obstacles specifically Black women faced, and if they were even allowed to be part of the ambulance service.
Yes, when Freedom House began, there was two females that were EMTs with the service. The drawback with that is they were unfortunately up in age. So when Pittsburgh consumed Freedom House, the job was just a little bit too rigorous for them. However, there was one individual that came to Freedom House later on, and her story is rather remarkable. She wasn't an EMT, so Pittsburgh EMS gave her a job at the city jail, working with prisoners. And while she was there, she went to school to become an EMT. Once she completed her EMT training, she went into paramedic training and then was hired by Pittsburgh EMS. While working for Pittsburgh EMS, she went back to school and became an RN, and subsequently worked in the emergency room at Presbyterian Hospital. Her story of perseverance and resiliency is really quite a documentary within itself. I just know of it, and she was there when I was there, but I can't tell it as well as she can. But for the most part, she's the only one that was able to survive the onslaught and remain with Pittsburgh EMS, and she subsequently retired about 10 years ago.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming. It's amazing to hear about this history. I never learned in EMT school. Amy, can we include that in the BEM summer course next year? I think it's really important. I'm from Los Angeles, and with the recent fires, there's been a lot of flack that our fire and EMS chief has gotten for her role in openly promoting DEI programs and diversity programs, and not to mention on the federal level.
Absolutely.
Executive order. What do you think that now that there is this not welcome opinions about diversity and hiring practices, what do you think patients lose from that? And further, what can we troublemakers do to stop that, to make sure that that doesn't go away? Because hearing this, it's really important you see the value of that.
That's a great point. What individuals can do, and just to let you know how important diversity is, it prevents preconceived ideas on what it would be like going into a person's home, particularly if you're going into a somewhat neglected, underserved neighborhood. You have a tendency to not suspect a severe medical problem based on their economic situation or their living conditions or what have you. I know that firsthand because it happened with Pittsburgh EMS. What EMS systems can do now is invest into your neighborhoods. I think there's a shortage of paramedics and EMTs. There's obviously a lack of diversity in this field. And the way to solve that is to invest back into the communities in which you serve. That's where your allies are. It's easy to put a hiring on Facebook, or Snapchat, or any of the other social media posts, but if I'm not reading that, I don't know. So I think I was very successful when I worked with Pittsburgh EMS because I went out into the community and I went to job fairs and I went to community centers and recruited people from there. And there are people that I recruited back in 1990 that are still with Pittsburgh EMS today. There are people that have retired and got a pension and benefits and things, all because someone stepped up and decided to do what was right rather than what was popular. So I think that's the key. That's the right thing to do. The popular thing to do is what we're doing now is nothing. And so you have to invest back into the communities that you serve. And I don't mean, just going out teaching CPR, going out speaking with them and letting them see the vehicles and the equipment that's on it. I guess communities have community day or whatever. Take a vehicle out there and have the paramedics give a walkthrough and talk to the people in the community and pass out flyers and pamphlets and open it up for opportunities.
Thank you for such a wonderful speech. That was a really fascinating story to hear. I was a little curious about the manufacturing process of the ambulance. Once you guys had made the design, like getting that built, how did you guys get that done? And were there any significant challenges that you faced with that as well?
Well, at the particular time, there was no model. And so once Dr. Saffer and Freedom House came up with the concept that I can't stand up in this vehicle and perform CPR, or if you look at the modern, I shouldn't call them modern day, the old ambulances that look like hearses, the seat was off to the side of the patient, not at the head. So there was nothing that individual that sat back there could do but look at the person. So we simply took that seat and put it at the head of the patient, which allowed you to manage the airway, to monitor their breathing. And then in order to, since I'm putting you there, I have to put the equipment readily available for you to use. So that was a shelf for the heart monitor, the suction unit, the oxygen unit. So all of those ideas came out of looking at other vehicles and determining the, I don't want to say failure of them, I'll say lack of the ability to perform the much needed care in them. So, Dr. Saffer was a genius in his own way. He knew what he needed to get done to solve the crisis that was at hand.
Hi, thank you for coming to talk to us. I just had a quick question, a bit about trust. You talk a lot about trust, and there's a running theme throughout the story of Freedom House with trust in the community. And I was wondering, when Freedom House kind of came to an end and Pittsburgh EMS became the main EMS provider in Pittsburgh, I was wondering, the community that Freedom House specifically served, like Hill District and all that area, I wonder how did trust of EMS officials evolve since then, from right when Freedom House ended to modern day? Has it ever reached the same level of trust that they had in the Freedom House providers?
It kind of wavers. A lot depends on what has happened in the course of history, over the course of the gentleman that it escapes me now, that received the I don't know what medication, Nichols guy that received the drugs while the paramedics went to jail. Those things remove the trust that you have with the people that are coming to take care of you. And unfortunately, it's politicized too, as well as public. So we didn't necessarily once we started and they started seeing the vehicles and things and getting accustomed to it, the community itself automatically started trusting us. Now, once Pittsburgh EMS started, they were able to publicly sell this concept as an improvement over the police, when we had been an improvement over the police for 7 or 8 years. So you're looking at municipal government taking the reign, and they had more of a voice to the public than we did, because we could only deal with one specific community. So they had their advantage. So it's almost like, I care about you so much, so I'm going to introduce this modern day super ambulances, is what they were called. So if I compare that super ambulance to the police, then basically there's not much of a comparison for. So I want the best care versus somebody that I don't know whether they're trained or not. So it was relatively easy to introduce that concept to the public from a municipal government standpoint, and we didn't have that.
Thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to thank you again for coming to speak with us. I just wanted to ask you a little bit about what the documentation process was like at the very start and how that kind of evolved throughout like the very early years.
I'm going to put one of we call them trip sheets, in my next presentation, because I'm glad you asked that. We had, it wasn't as detailed as they are today. It was ironic because we had pictures. Say, for example, a person was burned. You would kind of circle in the part of the body that was actually impacted by it. A person that's unconscious, not breathing, and didn't have a heartbeat, a cardiac arrest, was described as a 444, which simply meant that nothing was available. So we had a very basic way of writing things that would look like hieroglyphics today. And that's okay, because basically Dr. Nancy Caroline changed all that with us, and she instructed us to understand that we had to be more detailed in what was wrong with your patient, rather than somebody fell and hurt their arm. Did they fall because of a syncopal episode? What was the pertinent past history and medical conditions and medications and things like that? All of that stuff became pertinent, which is the things that are normal today. Our sheets were one sheet and just talked about the basics, and you checked off the box that applied. Not necessarily what you did for the patient, it was what was actually wrong with them. It emphasized the chief complaint more so than the treatment.
Thank you.
But that's a good idea.
And I have like kind of one quick follow-up question with that. Who
Yeah.
was actually reading these reports?
Dr. Caroline was reading them. And once we wrote them, we had debriefing sessions every Monday. And we would sit before our colleagues, and they would challenge us on the treatment of the patient. So the actual paramedic would have to justify why he initiated the treatment. So she read them all, and it was almost like going to school. She actually graded them. Yeah, that's how detailed she was, and you know, this lack of trust turned into love. I mean, we were crazy about her.
Thank you.
Once again, thank you so much for coming to speak to us. It's really interesting to hear you and about your experiences. I had a question more on like the legal side. As like the first ambulance service, obviously there were no like standard guidelines under like state protocols or like national levels, and I was kind of wondering like if you developed your own through Freedom House or kind of how that kind of process kind of worked out.
Well, remember, the Department of Critical Care Medicine was primarily responsible for the medical component of Freedom House. So it was almost as if this is what we do in the intensive care unit. This is what we do in the operating room. So we're going to take that concept, or the emergency room, we're going to take that concept and teach you how to do it in a person's home or out in the street. So you're absolutely correct. There was no state protocols or anything like that, except we had to go by the guidelines of the critical care medicine department of the hospital, because we were hospital-based. So, you know, we ended up, since there were no standards at all, why not write them? This is what we did.
Thank you.
I'll be here.
Hello.
Yes.
As others have said, it's such an honor to be here and to be able to hear your story. And you know, I think it really demonstrates such incredible strength, because you described a lot of spaces that were designed to make you feel like you didn't belong. Situations in which even your patients wouldn't want you to touch them. Your crew made you, you know, stand by the side and observe, and even the hospital staff. And so I was just wondering kind of what kept you driven, motivated towards that goal of, you know, community care, and that's kind of inwardly made you know that you did in fact belong in that space.
Well, a combination of things. I'm a firm believer to use hurdles and barriers and obstacles as motivators. And let me see this for a minute. If you get a chance to read this book, it kind of chronicles my life history from a young child, from 5, 6 years old, all the way up until adulthood. So my life was already predestined. It's just that obviously I didn't know it. So I spent 7, 8 years in an orphanage with about 60 or 70 other kids. And the goal at that time was to prepare you to handle the challenges that were going to impact you during the course of your life. So as a result of my upbringing, which was very, I don't look at it as traumatic. I look at it as a motivator. And, you know, obviously most people would look at it as that, but my early childhood played a very excellent example on how to deal with challenges and hurdles and problems as they come up. And when I did my diversity training at Pittsburgh EMS, that was all kinds of opposition to it, from the paramedics union to people that I'd work with and all kinds. So what I did is I used those as motivators. Okay, you don't want this here. I'm going to make sure I get these people through. And the people that I selected, failure was not an option. They didn't have an option to fail. Just to let you know, there were single parents in the class. And if they had to go to do a clinical rotation at a hospital, they would drop their kids off at my house, and I would babysit them. Yeah, that's how determined I was to make sure nobody was able to say, I told you so. Yeah, and I did it on city time. They didn't know it. So, you know, I'm one of the bosses. I just take in my vehicle and go home, and the person would drop their child off. I keep them for an hour and a half, and, you know, when they come back, pick the child up and go home with it. Yeah.
Hi, thanks again for being here. You were such an inspiration to all of us. Kind of going off of some of the other questions that were asked today, you spoke a lot just now about how you were able to overcome challenges, and I was wondering, obviously the mayor, his intention was to make you believe that you were powerless and to make your team believe that they were powerless also.
Right.
So I was wondering, within your team, were there mixed thoughts? Were some people ready to give up? And if so, how were you able, sort of as a leader in that time, able to, in addition to maybe addressing your own thoughts or your own concerns with maybe your ability or the possibility of your success, I guess how were you able to encourage your team as well to keep going?
Well, it was somewhat difficult because if I'm programmed to do things a certain way for a certain period of time, and you abruptly change that and don't give me an opportunity to adjust to it, then depending on the individual, I either accept it and run with it or just say, okay, I really don't have to deal with this. In addition to that, there were different ways that the department chose to get rid of people. Okay, John Moon's working today. I want y'all to keep an eye on him and make sure he does everything right. And so there were, lack of a better term, there were spies within Pittsburgh EMS whose specific purpose was to find ways to eliminate the people. Constant testing on stuff that we were programmed to do things Dr. Caroline's way, and here we go to this new service and you're doing things that are not standardized, for lack of a better term. So I have to kind of reprogram myself, and everybody wasn't able to do that. So the city of Pittsburgh EMS was happy to do that. We were always labeled as the people that came over from Freedom House. I wasn't a co-worker or whatever. Somebody asked, well, he's just one of the guys that came over from Freedom House. So we had to wear that label during that time frame. And once I was able to figure out what the overall intent was, then I had to adjust my thought process to prevent that from actually happening. And fortunately, I was able to do that.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for all your responses. They're very, very insightful. I had a question similar to the question about trust earlier, but sort of from the angle of like the trust between you and physicians like Dr. Saffer and Dr. Caroline. Like those relationships are very inspiring. I feel like those are relationships that we look for, like we look up to right now. How can we today as EMTs or paramedics in the room build meaningful relationships with those who might work in a hospital background or have more resources in those areas? How can we build those relationships?
Now, you can correct me if I'm wrong. You all have medical directors? Is the medical director working 24 hours a day? So when that person isn't there, there's somebody else taking this place? One of the things you can do is have your medical directors ride on the trucks and see firsthand what it is that you have to deal with, some of the challenges and things and the decisions that you have to make. That's how Dr. Nancy Caroline was able to find out, because I'm medical director. I need to know who my people are. I need to know something about them. So at Pittsburgh EMS, all emergency room physicians are required to spend time on paramedic units as part of their training. So you get a firsthand knowledge of what that individual is dealing with in someone's home or on the street or whatever the case is. And that's what opened Dr. Nancy Caroline's eyes. I mean, we had people that perhaps were injured in construction accidents, in deep holes and things like that. So we would go down there, and who do you think was down there with us?
Dr. Caroline.
Absolutely. Yeah. So you're talking about a trust factor. It's easy to tell that person you trust them, but trust is an action word. You have to show me.
Thank you.
I'm doing a ride along.
Please.
Hi, thank you so much for talking to us, by the way. This is my first time learning about Freedom House, and it's really inspiring to hear. I just wanted to talk about possible how Freedom House worked with the fire departments of Pittsburgh. As you may know, a lot of EMS today works with the fire department very closely, and you might even have to get an EMT license before you can work as a firefighter. So I was wondering if there was support for Freedom House from that realm of public safety, and if there's any collaboration between Pittsburgh Fire, if there's one at the time, and Freedom House. No. I see a no.
Absolutely not. The fire department was the fire department. We didn't care about them. Our biggest hurdle were the police. Just to give you an example, the police, if they were on a call and we showed up, that was many times, and I want you to distinguish the difference. I arrived on a call, and it was a vehicle accident, and we got there, and the police was pulling the person out of the car, and the steering wheel was bent, and the windshield was cracked, and all this, that, and the other. So we run up and said, no, wait, you can't just drag the person out. So I'm looking at a white male with a gun and a nightstick. So I got cussed out by the police. I wasn't cursed out, I was cussed out. And there's a difference. So it's the terminology is 100% different. So I'm getting cussed out by the police. The only thing I can do is he's telling me to get the black A, the F out of here, and whatever the case is. I have no other choice but to stand back and let him do that. So our main problem was with the police, and they looked at us probably as the political machine did, a threat.
Hi, if you could you talk about how the payment system sort of like evolved throughout like the EMS time?
How did what?
The payment system works? Like how did that?
The payment? You want to know how much they get paid now or back then?
More so like how did like I guess insurance come into the space, and like how did like everything get so expensive? Like sort of like now ambulance rides are like $1,000 or something. Like how did like what transition, like what was the patients paying back then in the Freedom House?
Roughly about $9 an hour. We at that time were receiving money from the city of Pittsburgh. We also had reached out to different foundations for grants and donations and things. So we were never really on solid financial footing, but we were able to make it work. And now, we were the very first to bill a person for transporting them to the hospital. Now it's a multi-billion-dollar business. We, back then, got paid roughly about $10 for taking someone to the hospital. And we would bill their insurance company. Remember, we're in this somewhat neglected, underserved neighborhood. So the insurance of choice was public assistance or welfare. So they only paid $10. So at that time, that's what we were paid. So it wasn't really a money-making venture. It was a nonprofit organization. So, you know, we had to make do. And I'm glad you asked that question, because you all will never be able to envision everything we had. The majority of the stuff we had on the truck was reusable. There was no disposable stuff on the vehicle. Oxygen mask, you use it, I get you to the hospital and take it back and send it to Central Sterile Service at the hospital. They sterilize it, put it in a plastic bag, and put it back on the vehicle. Intubation tubes. If you lived, great. If you didn't, I still took it out. and true, and sterilized it and reused it. Bag valve mask, all that stuff. There was no such thing as, you know, obviously we didn't reuse the needles and things like that, but the tubing, yeah, yeah, everything was reusable. We can re-sterilize it. No disposable stuff. You guys are living a life of luxury now.
Hi, Chief Moon. Thank you so much for coming to talk to us today. I had a question building off your mention of kind of the police being the biggest obstacle, and I wanted to know what you think about like co-responsive police and EMS today, and that being a big barrier of trust in Black and Brown communities when both the ambulance and the police car show up, and what you think we could do now and in the future.
Well, the police, until you separate the two systems and they know what their primary responsibilities are and things like that, you're still going to have that turf war between EMS and the police, or EMS and fire, what have you. Like I mentioned earlier, our only problem was the police, but for different reasons. Today, it's up to the political powers to kind of bring that merger or lack of it together. It's because whoever is your respective mayor or your respective community leader or whatever, that's part of their job, is to make sure these different public safety entities coexist. Don't get me wrong, I mean, Pittsburgh EMS had challenges with the Fire Bureau as recently as December, where they sent out a letter and wanted to start transporting patients because they thought the paramedics union was going to go on strike and stuff like that. So there's always one entity out there waiting to jump at that opportunity to take advantage of it. So it's up to you to make sure that doesn't happen. And hopefully, if you have the ear of your city leaders, basically, then you can offset those types of things. So a concerted effort has to be done with the politicians, or in your case, the deans or the campus presidents or whoever the case is, on how important your system is.
Thank you so much.
I think we probably are going to need to wrap up. We could be here and talking with you all day.
This is
That's amazing. We've got we've got books for you to sign. We really want to have Mr. Moon have a minute to take a break here, drink some water even. So if you might have some last parting words for the group, that would be a great way to sort of transition to the next phase of our day.
Yeah,
So, Mr. Moon? Your mic.
Oh, I really can't thank you all enough for this opportunity because I think it's an important part of history, number one, that's been intentionally forced under the rug for well over 50 plus years. So I really depend on the people I talk to, obviously yourselves, to kind of take this part of history back to your respective services or respective communities or what have you to tell them about the history of EMS. Getting EMS, the history taught in your EMT programs and your paramedic training and the EMS physicians programs and things like that will go a long way in keeping this part of history alive. So that's really what I would love for you all to do. Don't just say somebody came and talked to us today and told us the history of EMS. Take it back to your respective colleagues, and obviously the documentary plays a major role in it, as well as the book, American Sirens. But your voices are far more powerful than any of those two entities, from my standpoint. Thank you all so much. I'm not going anywhere. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. You want me to sit down now?